Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'll start with passing out my abstract, I guess, so you can all take a look. When I started this project, basically, I decided last spring that I wanted to do a capstone project, but it started with really, I've been writing poetry and short stories and anything really for a few years, since really my sophomore year, and really all I knew was I wanted to write a book of some kind. But going into it, I realized I really didn't have any sort of focus at all. So we'll start the presentation. The title of my whole project and my book is New Age Art, but it went through a few different stages, at least getting into it. When I started, it was just purely poetry. I was like, I want to write a book. I want to publish something and get my work out there. And then realizing going into February, I think I had 70 or so poems, and I was trying to narrow down, and it was just a nebulous mass that didn't have any sort of grounding to it. And when we got into the program and the research ended up being a huge part of it that I hadn't really thought about at first, I just sort of took that and said, okay, I'll research the publishing industry and how poetry sort of became this thing where, looking around now, I see a lot of books that are it's blank pages with just words on them, and I realize like a lot of my friends don't like reading it, and a lot of people I know just aren't so interested in it, and it's just because it's presented in a way that it's sort of separate from the other arts, which I didn't really like as much. So I was like, I want to try making a book that has sort of art combined with it and infused, and so it's one and the same. And so my research started out with that, where I was like, okay, how did poetry get to this point where it's been just this singular sort of entity without anything else connected to it? But after a few weeks, I realized that was just very dry, and it's a very interesting historical look at things, but I realized that I wasn't so interested in the historical part to it. And so I was left sort of wanting something else to grasp onto, because we were putting so much emphasis on the research. And then it came up that we all know we've had 3 suicides in the community this year, and I sort of realized I had personally been through some bouts with depression and things of that nature in the past few years, and I realized a lot of my writing had to do with that, and it was something I felt strongly about. So I went and talked to Mr. Finnegan, and he warned me. He was like, okay, that's a very, very heavy topic that can be very dangerous if you're trying to do that, and you have to do it in a specific way, otherwise it could blow up in your face. And so I took that and realized, okay, I can do that. So I took that advice and decided, yes, I want to shift my research completely to why mental health support systems fail or succeed in schools, which is the main thing my thesis deals with. And then that in turn led to a focus for my book. So the history part morphed into a mental health focus, where I sort of realized, like, when I was looking at specific stories like Roe Grootman of Newton South and Karen and other people, I realized a lot of them hadn't even, in other stories beyond North and South, hadn't even reached out to get any help before. And so it was those situations where it's a huge shock and surprise that were really sort of confounding. And I wanted to look at why. And so this presentation will end up being mostly about my book and that work I did, but the thesis I wrote ended up being a look at why students, even if we have great counselors and support systems, why students may not be reaching out for them, and why they're not going for that help, and then these huge shocking revelations are coming after the fact, and why we can't try to stop it beforehand. And so the 3 sort of reasons I came up with, they're all factors that go along with fear in the end, where students have this fear that they'll lose control of their life if, like, say they may admit to someone that they really need help. They may end up in a hospital or something, or they may go down in everyone else's eye, not be able to perform their best in school, and it's a fear of failure and the stigma and just the stress that goes along with all of that that combines into this huge mass, which is why it makes it so hard to deal with these things, because students don't know how to deal with all of that. And even if we have the best counselors in the state, or I don't even know what we consider, but they may not, if they don't reach out for the help, then they're not going to get any. So that's where my paper ended up going. And then when I took another look at my poetry work, I ended up getting sort of this focus in my head where I was saying, okay, I don't need to make this a clinical study, and I don't want to, but I can take what I've learned through this research and sort of narrow down my work. So I ended up putting 31 poems in my book that just recently, a couple weeks ago, I got published through this program called Blurb, which is very nice, but it also means that the cost is very high for printing. So I'll talk about that a little later. But so it ended up being a really nice focus for my book. And I only have 2 copies right now in hard, but I can pass them out for you to look through. And the rest of my presentation really is going to be looking at the progression of how I went from this focus to the whole process of putting it into an actual physical copy, because the work and the artworks that I designed to go along with this went through a whole bunch of iterations that I brought examples to show you, but it took a lot to finally get that final product. So when I started, I knew, actually I'll show you, I had a whole map planned out with these tons of different basically art projects that I wanted to try and see if I could turn them into something that could go into a book, but I ended up thinking that would be sort of a scrapbooky idea for things. So if you look, I grouped the poems into mini groups, and if you look, there's a million different ideas on there that I ended up thinking, I don't want this to look like a scrapbook. I want this to look like a really progressive idea. And when you get a chance to look at the book, you'll see the pages flow from one to the next, where the first half is all about sort of the darkness that can go along with the depression and the clouds and the really tough parts of it all. And for that, I ended up using, I made handprints using ink and charcoal, and then I would put them onto my computer and invert them to make them black and white, and they fade in and out in the first few pages of the book, or the first half. And then the second half, I'll explain, it ends up looking like fire sort of dripping down, but it's not really. I'll show you. So I would scan pieces of tissue paper to start with. Actually, can I turn off the lights? I don't know if this is easier to see. Oh, it's really hard to see. So this, oh, is it? Oh, okay. So it's harder than I was hoping to see. I would scan pieces of tissue paper, and then they were white, and then I'd invert them on my computer to make them black. So it's hard to see, but it's that crinkly background you see in the first half of the book. And that's sort of the basis for the whole thing. And then I went on from that, and I ended up choosing the handprints out of all the other pieces because I wanted to show half of them are all sort of this mutated, morphed, to sort of show the darkness and the evil or monster that can come out of it. And then the other half are this, which is just a pure handprint that I used charcoal to make. I just rubbed it on my hand and placed it. But what would happen is I'd scan all these artworks, put them on my computer, and go to Photoshop, and I'd invert them so they'd turn this with a black background and sort of look more like an X-ray in the end. So that was how I wanted them to appear, because I wanted the first half to be dark and black and white, and then to go into more color in the second half. And then from there, I would take, I actually cut out a bunch of different newspaper clippings, and then I would tape them together to make different headlines than what they actually were when they appeared in the newspaper. And I'd cut those out on Photoshop and splice them onto the image. So that's how I actually built up those images that you see And then this is the sort of more mutated handprint that I took, that I used ink and charcoal for. And again, I would invert them and put them together. So that is how I started with the first half. And I have sort of more to show you. I went through, before I actually decided on using this, there were a million different pieces of artwork I had thought about using. I don't know, I can just pass them around. But I had actually gone, and that's what that sheet, a lot of those I ended up making and then decided later that I wasn't so interested in it. So really, it looks like it all came together in the end, but it took a lot of messing around and working through it. Because I ended up talking with a psychiatrist, Dr. Peter Adams, and he was telling me about how he was sort of backing up a lot of my work and helping me refine my thesis, but then it also turned out he was a big influence on this artwork, where he sort of agreed with me that it would be much better and more effective to make it a progressive, like cohesive work instead of a scrapbooky, like, oh, I'll throw in a few of those like little things and like every few pages the whole theme will change. So I went on from that, and I would do the same thing, splicing on the newspaper bits. And then we went to the second half, and again, it's hard to see. But if you look in the book, the second half looks like, I've heard from like a lot of my friends that it just looks like fire basically coming down. I wasn't using fire. That's actually just coffee that I ended up messing with in Photoshop. So what I would do is I had my dad and I poured a big pot of coffee into sort of this rectangular prism, and then I took it outside on our deck and set up my camera to take a close-up shot of it. And I would have he was dripping cream actually into it, one drop at a time, as I was snapping shots of it. So this is actually what the original images looked like. So they didn't actually, originally I wasn't planning on a fiery sort of look. It turned out that this is what they ended up looking like, and I wasn't so happy with it. So then, because I wanted it to be a more rich sort of coffee look to it, but then I realized I wasn't into this, so I said, okay, we'll mess with it in Photoshop, and that's how it became this, basically. And I ended up liking it, and it went along nicely with the theme, where all of a sudden in the second half you get this bright burst of color that's coming in. And the same thing, I would go through and spice on the newspaper images and combine them in that way. And then the last few pages are similar, but I would wait, and if you let the cream sit in the coffee for a while without mixing it, it'll get this sort of this stringy, I don't know if you've ever seen it, it won't mix in on its own, so it gets, if you look in the last few pages, it just turns into like this stringy, like globular mess that'll go. So I would take those images, and I actually did burn a few pieces of paper, and then I took those and inverted them and slipped them behind the images and put a filter over it so it looked more like it was a burned page, actually. So that's the process I went through for making all of those. And then that's the image sources for my book. But the image sources for my presentation. And then I also wanted to show you, when I was going through the writing process, it took, this whole notebook is filled with not all the poems that are in there, but most of the possibilities I went through. And this took a few years. This is a few years in the making. And then this one I'm starting on now. But a lot of the ones that are in the book came from this. Because I think about 2/3 of them were completely new that I wrote this year, and about 1/3 I took from a few years back or so and like reworked them and re-edited them to make them all fit. And so I realized at the end that my research and my book are not directly related, but I felt like they were closely enough related thematically that I felt like they fed nicely off of each other. So that's it. Yeah. about it. Yeah. So I don't know if you have any questions or...
Mackey, what is it that you want people to get from this book, if there's anything?
I want people to this was never about making money or anything. I want it to just be spread around. I want the community to have access to it. So I want people to just understand the message that, one, it's okay to talk about it. Like, people have this fear, if we talk about it, it'll make more kids have trouble. It won't help. But if you read through the first half of the book, that's basically, a lot of it shows the darkest points kids can get to, and I don't think, I want to sort of show people that just reading or talking about it is not going to make those feelings come up in other people. So just getting it into people's heads and able to bring it up is one thing that I really wanted to come from it. And the other is, I actually went to the graphics department and they're printing 75 copies of it right now for a cheaper price, because online I think it costs $40 right now for a copy, which is not what I wanted the community to be able to have access to it. So I've had a free PDF version I've shared on Facebook, and when graphics finishes, they'll be about $10 a piece, I think, and I'll just sell them back to people in the community. 'Cause I've had teachers and friends come up to me and say, one, I'd really like a copy of this if it's easy to get, and then two, I've actually had people say that they've been able to talk about their feelings more. A few people who have very strongly related to it and come forward, and one of my friends actually said he wants to go and make something similar, but not exactly. He wants to base it off of African American history and how he views being black now in Newton and in this current modern day. So really, it started as a personal, sort of selfish project. I just wanted it to be for me, and I just wanted to produce something. But then it turned into, once I found that focus, I want everyone to be able to see that you can express how you're feeling in any number of ways, but all of them are okay. I don't know, if you want to see any other work, I can pass it around. But
is that the main thing that you'd say you learned from the process? I mean, how was you talked about trying to figure out sort of the relationship being thematic between the research and the book. So how do you feel like that process went? It sounds like you said it was kind of your own interest, and then it became sort of this thing that you think that as a product could benefit the community.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that connect to the research process? What do you feel like you got out of doing the whole research process versus producing this?
Yeah, well, I think one of the main things is just going purely through the process. I realized that you don't always have to follow exactly what other people are doing, because I'd say 80 or 90% of the people in CAPS ended up being, their research was directly applicable to exactly what they were doing in their field work. And I think it was sort of liberating to find a way where, originally that's what I was going for, with the history of publishing poetry and looking at that, and then finding a way to separate it so that I could get both. I wanted the research and the book, but still having them be connected, and finding my own connection was a real, I don't know if that answers your question, but that was what the real value came out of it for me was, okay, I can do both and still make it meaningful. Yes.
Did you have some strategies to not get overwhelmed by the material?
Yeah, so actually that was one of the other things going into the research initially, Mr. Finnegan, one of the things we talked about was you need to be careful when you're doing all this reading and researching not to get bogged down, because it can really, what you're learning can really feel helpful and good in some respects, but if you go too far and too deep into each story, it can get overwhelming in a sense. So I limited myself to only reading a few different sources per day when I think I had about a week-long period where I was intensively researching and note-taking. And I would go to the library but say, okay, I can only read up to 4 or 5 articles today, and then I'll focus on those, but I won't worry about anything else right now. And so that's how I had to sort of keep that separate. And when it came to the book, splitting up the writing with sort of the artworks made it easier to do it that way, because the artworks were more like they lightened a lot of what I was feeling. But it was a balance.
I'm sorry.
No.
You talked about the blurb and publishing. What was that process, and how did you sort of find them? Or
One of the other girls doing a Capstone project, Lee Gagazian, came into the whole program from the start and was like, I'm using Blurb and I'm going to make a cultural cookbook sort of thing. And I was in a group with her at the beginning, and she showed it to me. And up until that point, I hadn't thought about what I was going to do. I thought I might make some sort of manuscript and submit it to some publishers, or maybe find some way I could self-publish. But then when I looked at the Blurb website, it's a whole program where you can download the software to upload your images and work, and it's just a way to combine them easier, where they say, okay, we'll accept these formats, and then instead of having to do it all in Photoshop yourself, we'll integrate it for you, and then we'll print it. So that, I found it through Lee, basically, and then I realized it took a few test runs, actually, because there are a few ways you can do it. You can either do it right on their website, or through Lightroom, Adobe Lightroom, or through their own program. And I ended up using their own that I downloaded. And so I actually went through 2 versions that didn't end up working out before I got this one to work.
And and that's how they support you, and then they publish it for you. So that's sort of how it works.
Yes.
Okay.
And so that's why I sort of went to graphics, because they print them for you, and they can help you sell them if you want. But because it's going through middlemen and they're connected with Amazon, so it's basically 2 big name companies both trying to turn a profit on your own work also, which is why the price got bumped up so much. But then they give you a PDF version when you upload it. So that's what I took to graphics and said, oh, I have this like high quality file, can you print it for me? And I'm going to go see them later today, actually, to see, but I think they said this week they might be able to get some in, because they've been doing it for the past few days. But, yeah.